one. Well, hello and welcome to the Creative Writing Life podcast, where we talk with writers from all mediums and genres about themselves, their work, and advice they have for writers. I'm your host, Paul Zeidman, and my guest today is Lee Upton. And Lee Upton is a poet, a fiction writer, and a literary critic. And of course, she's the author of several books of poetry, fiction, and literary criticism. She's also a former professor of English and a writer in residence at Lafayette College in I knew I was going to mess that up, Easton, Pennsylvania. I want to say Eastern Pennsylvania. Technically, it is Eastern, but the city is called Easton. Her work has appeared in The New Yorker, The Atlantic, The New Republic, The American Poetry Review, The Harvard Review, and Double Take. Lee Upton, welcome to the Creative Writing Life podcast.
Well, thank you so much. I'm really delighted to be able to talk with you.
Oh, my pleasure. We're looking forward to talking about Tabitha's book. See, I'm not. My mind is not. Didn't it say Lee's book called Tabitha Get Up? It's a very, very interesting book. I enjoyed it over the weekend, so I'm looking forward to talking about that. But Lee, if you're familiar with the show, what we like to start things off is that we talk about things we may have read or watched lately. Did we like them? Did we not like them? Or were we kind of indifferent about them? I'll go first, just to give you a little time to collect your thoughts. So I've watched a couple of things. There is a cinema group here in San Francisco, and they've had a monthly series called The Streets of San Francisco, where they show a movie based in San Francisco. And this month it was the all-time classic, The Maltese Falcon, which I've already seen many times, but to see it on the big screen was just wonderful. And it was pretty much a packed house at the theater, so that was great. Still loved it. And over the weekend, my wife and I said, well, let's try to watch something fun. And so we went to, I think it was Amazon Prime, and there was a movie called Nandor, Fodor, and the Talking Mongoose, which is a movie with Simon Pegg and Minnie Driver and Christopher Lloyd, and it was terrible. We didn't make it about 20 minutes before we just looked at each other and said, it's just so slow and so boring and dull, and it was listed as a comedy, and I think comedy and mystery or comedy adventure. It was neither of those, and so very disappointing. I think my wife later on, or the next day, she decided she was just going to scroll through it to try to find out about the mongoose and if it got any better, and she said no, it did not. So kudos to her for taking the bullet on that one. Lee, what about you? Anything interesting on the reading or watching front?
Well, let's see. After Donald Sutherland's death, I was looking at Donald Sutherland movies, and I had never heard of a movie I should have known about, Bertolucci's 1900, that Sutherland did and plays the most terrifying fascist, and it's just a brilliant movie. Amazon has it. They have the extended edition. It's over 5 hours.
Yeah, sounds about right.
Yeah, and so for 48 hours, to rent it, I wound up buying it. Not just because it takes a long time to watch it, but you have to recover because it's so horrendous and violent. So I would really recommend it. But you gotta protect yourself a bit while you watch it. It's got Robert De Niro, wonderful actors in it. But Sutherland is such a memorable actor in it. I more recently, before then, I'd seen him in Clute, and there's so much kind of gentleness and restraint, and so to see him this horrifying psychopath was really, really interesting. Something else I watched recently, you're probably really familiar with The Wicker Tree at all?
I've heard of The Wicker Man, but not
The Wicker Man. The Wicker Man.
Oh, yeah, I haven't seen the Nicolas Cage one, but I have seen the original. I want to say 1973.
It is 1973, but I'd always heard of it, and one of my daughters is a real horror buff. So finally I watched the 1973 kind of folk horror, and it was such fun. And I didn't recognize Christopher Lee. I'm used to kind of older Christopher Lee, and he's there in a turtleneck, and Britt Eklund is getting far too familiar with a wall, but then it turns out that it was a body double. So that was terrific. And then after watching that, then I had to watch the Nicolas Cage one, because Nicolas Cage is just so fun and so magnetic. And that was really hilarious. I don't know, he can say anything and I will listen to him. Just the intonations, everything is so dramatic and overwrought and comical, but also I can identify with that at the same time. So that's
Okay.
really a lot of fun, and another horror movie, but it has really delightful moments in it. Yeah.
No, yeah, like I said, I haven't seen the Nicolas Cage one. All I know is there's a line where I guess he's trapped in something and they like unleash a swarm of bees on him and he goes, "Oh, the bees," or
Yeah.
something like that. That's all I remember.
Yeah, there's a real meme of that, because in the original, it's apples. So this one,
Ah,
it's bees, and it's a matriarchy with Nicolas Cage. Yeah, don't want to
okay.
give too much away.
Well, we are in the fall season, so I mean, if you want a good folk horror, either version of the Wicker Man, I guess you can't go wrong with that. So Lee Upton, let's talk a little bit about you. Were you the type who was always a writer as a kid? I've had writers on who said, "Oh, I wasn't much of a writer, but I was a voracious reader." Were you both? Were you favoring one or the other?
I was a big reader when I was really young, and I always said I didn't know poets could be real people. I thought you'd have to be dead in order to write. But yeah, I wrote from an early age. I think the only time in my life when I didn't write quite so often was probably in part of high school, in that or hormonal overwash of high school.
Okay.
I stopped for a while, but otherwise I've always written. It's always been something that's given me a lot of both excitement and comfort at the same time.
No, who were some of your favorite authors when you were growing up?
Oh, well, I remember the first book I ever cried at was I can't quite remember the author's name, but it was a book about Robin Hood, and he
Oh,
dies. Yeah, he dies in the book, and I wasn't prepared. I, like probably many other children, as a child, I really loved Anne of Green Gables as a child. I also, you know, I read a lot of, my mother tells me that and I remember this actually, but that I read a lot of Shakespeare as a child, really early. And I didn't understand it, but I liked, my mother has this story, or had this story, that I would be in the basement and with a knife and acting things
oh
out.
my
So
gosh.
yeah, so I love to read, love to write. How about you? Were you the same way?
I was a huge reader when I was little, and I just started to write just because I liked it so much. But I really didn't develop a love of writing probably until like leave out of junior high into high school, and then it
Mhm.
was when I was in college because it was always about I just love writing. I like when I went through this phase in high school. I loved writing one act plays. Of course, I stole tons of jokes from other comedians just because I didn't know any better. Uh, and it was really when I got into college and I started taking more film courses that I just developed, hey, there's this thing called screenwriting. And like,
Mhm.
wow, you can actually do this. You could, potentially make a living from it. And you could tell, and I loved movies and I loved writing. So it was just for me, it was the perfect combination. So that's
Mhm.
why I'm still working at it today. And I love do it. I love doing it because I love the process of coming up with a story, figuring things out and trying to entertain the reader slash audience. And just because I always tell writers, write something you would want to watch. And so
Mhm.
that I think that's a big influence on the way I write and what I write. And I think for a lot of writers, it is that way as well. Maybe they don't realize it at the time. It's like on a subconscious level, but I think they really enjoy that. Okay, so you talked about some of the books that you really enjoyed. Were a lot of those or any of those a big influence on you as a writer? I mean, you talked about Shakespeare. I mean, you can't get much more influential than that.
Yeah, I suppose for poetry,
Hmm,
Emily Dickinson was an influence,
sure.
certainly. And but it was really I can tell you how I started writing poetry because I wrote poetry. I wrote poetry and fiction, but for quite a few years it was principally poetry. And now poetry is still kind of in my heart, and it's the sustaining work I do. I always will write poetry, and it's always foremost for me. But I know when I was in college, I saw on a billboard information about a writing conference, which I could reach by bus, and I went, and the poet Robert Bly was there. You might remember him from Iron John and kind of masculinity studies, but this was before then. And I went alone. I had to get back very soon. I didn't have a car. I had to get on the bus, but he made this wonderful offer. He said, I'm going to be on that hill over there, and if anyone wants to talk to me, you just come. And so I went, brought my sheaf of poems, and what he said to me was so helpful, because he looked through all my poems and he said, these could be worse. And for me, it was like, oh, wow, these could be worse. Oh my gosh, that's a real possibility for me. So I think that opened it up for me. And then I was actually, as an undergraduate, I was a journalism major. And I worked my way through school by writing freelance stories for the newspaper. They're the capital newspaper, the Lansing State Journal. Usually I was in a section called Living Today, which is very funny because, I thought about when people picking up the phone would always have to say Living Today. But it was wonderful because I got to interview writers, well, mainly performers coming to town. Lynn Anderson, the country singer, Wolfman Jack, the radio personality, Frank Sinatra Jr. I got
Oh,
to
wow.
interview. Yeah, he was lovely. I will say at first he wouldn't let me interview him because I came at him cold. He was singing at a hotel, and but my sister was with me, and she said, just keep trying him again. So I kept trying him again, and I'd come up to the table, can I interview you? And finally he said, sit down. And he said, I thought you were just a high school kid. I thought you were a little kid. And but then, he gave me a good interview, and I knew enough not to ask about his father,
Sure.
but he talked a lot about mental fitness. He talked about how, one has to be very strong mentally, and that was very much on his mind. So that kind of work was really useful for me, even with the book Tabitha Get Up, because she's a biographer and she's interested in actors. And I spent a lot of time interviewing actors when I was an undergraduate.
Of course. I was going to say that you've written in so many different fields. I mean, poetry, short fiction, nonfiction. So what was the impetus for saying, I'm going to write a novel?
Well, when I've always along the way written short stories, even though at first I published poetry and then literary criticism, but I was always writing short stories, but they tended to be monologues. There was usually one voice upset. So that was kind of the energy for it. Then I learned how to add a few more voices, but I actually just along the way kept writing more and more novel length works. And in my collections of short stories, oddly enough, there are stories that really were chipped away from novels that I felt didn't quite work as novels. I didn't know how to orchestrate enough or how to make them cohesive. So in those collections, there are a number of stories there that are really bred and born from actual whole novels. So I have a novel coming out in 2026 that was actually written before Tabitha, and that novel is quite grim. I mean, there are organ piracy and all. So writing Tabitha was,
that is a grim subject.
I needed something comical in my life, and but the novel. in a way, I'd always been sort of experimenting. Another novel coming out next year is a kind of literary mystery, and both that novel and the novel coming out in 2026, they follow more conventional structures.
Right.
But I must say, writing Tabitha Get Up was some of the most fun I've ever had writing anything. I mean, I would get up in the morning and just get to work and move forward with
Okay.
it.
Yeah. So I have a ton of questions about the book itself. Like, first of all, let's start off. Like, what was the inspiration for the idea behind the story? And please feel free to give like the thumbnail description of what the story is.
Okay. Well, the thumbnail description, Tabitha Get Up is a novel about a biographer who hasn't had much luck in her life. Her biographies don't sell at all. She's, very broke and has been broke often, teetering right at the point where things are especially difficult. She can't afford to pay her rent, but one summer, something miraculous happens for her. Two celebrities are going to be in her little tiny town, and she makes up her mind that she's going to regain her self-respect and be able eventually to pay her rent if she writes biographies about these two people, because when is she going to get a chance like that again? The one person is an actor so charismatic and beautiful that his face is on the side of buses. The other person, her name is Piper Fields. She's a children's book author who also writes erotica with a really fanatical cult following. So the novel is about this character, Tabitha's quest to regain herself, her self-respect, and also to feel more connected to other people. You'd asked about the inspiration for it. It actually comes from a long short story that I wrote that just didn't work. Of course, I thought it worked at first, and then I realized it doesn't work, but it's been a very lucky short story for me. The problem with the short story was that it was too complex. It just was, to fulfill itself, it would have to be a novel. And that's the novel that comes out in 2026. It's called The Withers. Tabitha Get Up comes from an email within that failed short story I wrote. The email was by a character who was very greedy and grasping and shallow. I loved her. I just loved writing her voice. The voice was very galloping and had lots of energy. And I thought, and I started and I thought, this voice is such fun. I mean, just the rhythms of it. I'm going to start with this. But then I very quickly realized that I didn't want to spend 300 pages with that woman. And so what I did was I thought about the character more, made her really quite different, gave her some flaws, some failures, put her in a small town, but gave her these enormous desires. And I think that that's so often the engine of these enormous desires. So that story was kind of the root I drew from. An incident also was sort of important to me. A person who was very accomplished, a woman, and talked to me about how she felt about turning 50. And I was thinking that so many novels, and I love the novels too, but they're about 20-year-olds or 30-year-olds and romance and love. But it's so much a case that every year is different. Every year, the old rules shift. Your old way of being doesn't work anymore. So, continually have to think about things. So I also told myself, I'm going to have someone 50 years old in this. So those were some of the key factors. Also, COVID, like many people during COVID, what I wanted to do was to find a way to lift my own spirits. And so you'll notice in the novel, there's a bar that's the best bar in the world, the end of the world. Like you don't even need to drink, you just go in and you feel good. So I gave her a bar. You know, it was early in COVID when we weren't even walking outside without masks. And, you know, so I give her a lilac grove. And so I think the pleasure of it was creating these fantasies, but that I could transport to other people too. So they weren't only for me. So those were some of the various roots for the
Okay,
novel.
well, the thing is, I have so many questions that I'm going to start with the first one. That one of the things I've mentioned this before on the show is that with screenwriting, a lot of times, a lot of the characters are some aspect of the writer's personality. That it may be something small or relatively insignificant, but that character, you can see yourself in that character. So the big question for you, so how much of Tabitha is a reflection on you? I mean, is it part of you? Is she the total opposite of you, and that's part of why you had so much fun writing her? I mean, what is your connection with Tabitha?
Well, I must say that I'm very protective toward her, which means that she must come from some element of myself or you know, memory of my sisters or other people I
Hmm.
love. But I know that I'm protective toward her, you know, so I feel a little hurt if people would say things about her. I've written that I think she has a very precise form of intelligence, and she's not delusional or you know, she's just has a way of being in the world that is a way that she's not ideologically captured. She's grew up kind of feral with that remarkably self-absorbed mother. Oh, I will tell you, my mother was the opposite of that mother. I had the sweetest, kindest mother. It's just almost amazing. But it's really fun to, I think that, you know, so much of our life is spent trying not to hurt other people and trying to be thoughtful. So it's really nice to write really mean characters. You know, I think it does something to the kind of censorious scolds in our minds. It kinds of frees them. So I loved writing the mother. I think that you know, there are incidents in the novel that I draw from my own life, or there's a you know, I owe to my youngest daughter. There's a little portion about Matthew McConaughey in there about how there's a character who feels that when she sees him on screen, she can smell him.
Hmm.
That's my little my daughter when she was younger would always say that. So I owe that to her. So there are bits and pieces I think that I drew. I think in I don't know if it's maybe it's the same for you too, that there's always the emotional sense. I mean, I know the emotions of this character. I know what it's like to be rejected. I know what it's like to feel outside. I know what it's like to just want to dissolve into the floor. In
Hmm.
other words, I'm human.
Sure, sure.
So,
Uh,
what about for you? Do you find you drawing from your emotional experience a good deal?
I think it really depends on the character and the situation in the story. That because a lot of times it's what works best for the story, not what the writer wants to happen.
Mhm.
Because you need to have it all be, telling the story, and the character may do something that I personally would not do, but this is what the character needs to do.
Yeah.
And also, you have to have things that flow organically in the story, not like this has to happen because the story demands it, but you have to
Mhm.
have it be authentic and also have it feel, like I said, organic and realistic, rather than that it's shoehorned in there just to make the sure the story is effective. That if you have to do that, then you're not you're cheating the audience out of that
Mhm.
authentic emotional experience. And I find that in when a lot of writers, or when they're starting out, at least for screenwriting, that the writing is very, it's right there on the page. It's there's no depth to it. There's no subtext. It's just kind of like, this is what happens, and this I'm saying
Mhm.
what I mean, and I'm not going to embellish it at all. It just takes time to develop that skill, as I'm sure as it would with pretty much any other kind of writing.
Mhm.
But I did want to ask you real quick that there are so many situations that happen throughout the story that Tabitha is always at the heart of, and where she's impacting in some way or another. Are any of those based on things that happened to you, or things you people you knew they happened to? I mean, it doesn't have to be anything specific, or like, oh, my sister had this. It's a like a horse statue, I want to say. Uh,
Pony,
oh yeah,
yeah.
it's a like a ceramic pony, and it's got the paint's coming off. Forgive me if I'm getting all the details a little muddled, but I mean, is that like, oh, that was something that my sister had that kind of horse?
Yeah, well, I think that yeah, I mean I know you know, for instance, the character talks about breaking her foot. I broke my foot in 3 places. The character talks about applying for a job in a restaurant, and she's not even allowed to fill out an application, but then she thinks, oh, it's her coat. And that happened to me, and I did think to make myself better, I did think, oh, it's his coat, I look like Stalin, what am I doing? So some things like that. I remember being a young woman, in that sense of really yearning that you have, and you want your life to be larger. And I think that that's very much about her life. The bar, I've never been in a bar that's that wonderful. So that's totally invented. I think too, I'm working on a manuscript now. It's kind of about a relationship between 2 women, and one is very dominant toward the other woman. And I think that it was interesting for me as I worked through Tabitha Get Up, that Piper Fields, a children's book author, who's also the author of erotica, or supposed to be it anyway, that eventually they kind of become friends. And so I think that when I look at that novel, Tabitha Get Up, there is a sense that, gradually, for these famous people who have plenty of money, who have adulation, I think that's a common fantasy, that one could be somehow accepted, even if one didn't have money, didn't have the physical beauty, do you remember something do you remember Susan Boyle on American Idol? Do you remember that at all? Or
Was it
maybe it was British.
Yeah, Britain's Got Talent. Yeah, she, this
Britain's Got
very
Talent.
plain, drab-looking woman had this amazing singing voice.
Yeah, I think I remember when that first came out, I used to play that again and again and again. There's something about that I think speaks to something in where human beings want to kind of enlarge their lives by upsetting expectations. And I think that's also why I wanted so much to write a comic novel, because comedy depends on upsetting expectations again and again and again. And so to have someone who seems to have no prospects finally be really accepted by both of these people who have everything that she doesn't, I think is a kind of, it's like the wish to go to heaven or whatever. There's something about that I think is about love, and I think a lot of the book is really a lot about loneliness, and how loneliness can prey on people.
I could definitely see that. I did want to ask you that, just kind of thinking about everything that happens over the course of the book, like, how did you develop the story? That did you come into it thinking, okay, I'm going to have this, I've got this character, what can happen? Like, what was the development process for putting it all together for you?
Normally I would have, a situation, a kind of character, and then I might have, drop, kind of a what if, and, stagger different possibilities. This novel wasn't like the other novels I've written at all, because it seemed to come out kind of whole cloth.
Hmm.
I maybe because, a version of the character Tabitha had appeared already in a short story, although greatly modified. So I had a situation, that, okay, I'm going to make her wildly ambitious, because comedy is so much about floundering under the weight of our own pressures, how we can be
Hmm.
afraid of how we'll treat ourselves if we fail. And comedy lets us fail and survive. So I think, knowing kind of that I'm working with a genre, but that I'm playing with the romantic comedy tropes in some way too. And, so in some ways I've watched enough of those movies in my life. So structurally, it came together more easily for me. I don't know if it will ever happen to me again. I had two branches. I had the story of the actor and the story of the children's book author. And so it's a kind of braid where how do I bring those two together and then eventually kind of get them closer. Sometimes when I'm working on fiction, I draw the characters, and sometimes I draw the form of the piece. The novel I have coming out next year, it's a literary mystery called Wrongful, where it's a literary mysteries are always about, or mysteries about everyone getting everything wrong. And so it has a structure of people just getting things wrong. But I gave myself with that book a kind of challenge to write multiple voices. So there are multiple voices, then one voice through the center and the bulk of the novel, then multiple voices again at the end. With Tabitha Get Up, it almost works more like poetry. Even all the white space is a little like poetry, or the jumps. I think because once I had the character and a kind of idea that she was going to write notes to herself, it became very different from anything else I've written, because it was so much of it was thinking, okay, what's her trouble today, but also what's her joy? She has that wonderful nephew named Leon, who is just, a source of strength and comedy and connection in her life. And so part of structurally was thinking about who's going to come in next. I don't know, if you do this, but I often will have kind of a list and I'll think, okay, what could happen? What could happen? And I'll write down a lot of different possibilities about what could happen. But, eventually I'll feel almost a physical tug. Like, this is what should happen next. This makes sense. This tests the character. This challenges her. This is where she would move next. But I have to somehow write a long list before I get an idea of that. This was, though, just to be transparent, it came about during a really difficult time in my life. I needed to write this during, a series of crises, and an immediate family member was, very, very ill with chemotherapy and radiation. And so I think one reason why the novel, more than anything I've written, kind of almost wrote itself, was because I needed it so much to have a space, a kind of nest where, I could feel I could recreate strength for myself. So I laughed all the way through writing this novel, despite, the difficulty of my life. That was a place where I would laugh a lot. And then I also felt too, it was sort of during COVID, in a weird way, you're so isolated, but you're also feeling connected with other people. At the same time, in the house, illness, cancer during COVID was really hard. During COVID was very hard, just, of the rules and regulations and all too. So just to put a stopper on that, everything's, fine. And with my family member, we're great. Tests are great. So, but I guess that is part of writing the novel very much. And I think that's even kind of in the novel, something I noted. I wrote a little essay about writing the novel, and I looked up, my anxieties are in that novel because I looked up how many times I think it might be the word death occurs, and it's 51 times. And then I looked up how many times die occurs, and I think I might have these reversed, but it's 74 times. But I think that's what comedy does. I think comedy grazes up against mortality. It grazes up against cowardice. It grazes up against the lure of forgetting. It grazes up against embarrassment and humiliation and disintegration. And then it's defiant. Comedy is finally kind of defiant. And so the form of that it was comedy, even though, there are times when the novel shifts out of the comedic almost drastically. I think that, at the same time, I think that when people talk to me about the book, it makes them feel good. And that was one of my hopes.
I totally understand that. Did want to ask, it's a very unique approach to how the story is told. I mean, at least how it looks on the page, that it is entirely from Tabitha's point of view, that there's a ton of internal dialogue, streams of consciousness, if you will, just like what she's thinking, because like she'll be talking about something and all of a sudden like, oh, that's an interesting word that came up as part of her sentence. So, and then there's also details and information are provided like via, here's a text from her mother, here's a message from her publisher, here's a voicemail from that actor. So was this all part of your initial plan, or did you think as you were writing, did you even start in a more traditional format and then decide, actually, you know what, I like this character so much, I'm going to have everything we're going to be in her head, and like things that we see and we hear, that's going to be how I'm going to tell the story?
I think I just wanted to stay in her head, and maybe it's a little bit of laziness too. Like let's stay in her head, but go into scenes and have her. You have to suspend disbelief because
Sure.
it's she's recreating scenes, but then in another way with this character, she is so word drenched and
Hmm.
loves language so much, so it makes sense that she would copy down everything she hears and thinks and feels to sort of keep herself afloat, the title Tabitha Get Up, there's I have it in the epigraph as well. It's from the Bible,
Hmm.
where a woman named Tabitha, we know nothing about her, other than I think she makes clothing and she is beloved, dies, and it's the Apostle Peter who raises her from the dead. And in different translations, some translations are Tabitha rise, other translations are Tabitha get up. And I love Tabitha get up. And it's sort of fitting because Tabitha gets up, but then you never hear from her again. You don't know what happened to her, but she does come back to life. And I think one thing about the character kind of loves making fun of herself and her situation if the language is interesting to her. Um, so I think so given the character, she would perhaps really do this tally continually of her life.
Okay. Okay. I totally get that. I thought it was such a unique way to present this story. Was it really challenging to do it in that format? Like I said, like, we'll hear what Tabitha is thinking, and we'll get dialogue between her and other characters, and sometimes it's direct, but also sometimes this person leaves a voicemail, and this is the text of that voicemail, or they send a text message, or here's an email from her publisher, and then here's her responding email to the publisher. So while you were putting the story together, did you think, okay, this is how I want to present all of this information in these formats? Or was it that you started a more traditional way and you thought, okay, actually, I think this would be more interesting that we really get inside her head this way?
Yeah, as soon as I had the idea that they would be notes, then it seemed a kind of natural way to do it. I know that I've had some writers think, oh, now that we all have cell phones, that some of the mystery is gone out of writing, or with your
Hmm.
thriller, people can always contact each other. Where's the mystery? How are you going to work it out? But I actually think that because we have cell phones and have so much screen time, things are actually just more confusing, and we send each other messages, and have you ever gotten one of those emails or sent one of those emails, and you're in a great mood, but people think you're angry at them or whatever. I mean, there's so many possibilities for miscommunication. And Tabitha's mother, of course, just sends her those those voicemails so that Tabitha doesn't even have to pick up.
Mhm.
And so it came pretty quickly. There was a bit of a shift. Initially, I kept trying to shoehorn in a different beginning,
Mm.
but it was sort of too grim. The original beginning, the incident is in there, and it went through multiple revisions, and it still was in there, about a hope chest that Tabitha at her wedding got a hope chest. Do you know what a hope chest is? Maybe people don't know what that is
I
anymore.
am familiar with the term.
Yeah, I have one upstairs that my mother got me, and I've tracked it around from apartment to apartment. It's so heavy and all, but because she gave it to me, I would never get rid of it.
Of
But
course.
anyway, in the novel, the hope chest is never opened because Tabitha knows about an old, Irish or English folk tale about a bride who ran away from a people thought she ran away from the wedding, but no, she was just going to play a trick on the groom and hide and seek, and got in the hope chest. And they find her years later, her corpse, and the inside lid has all these scratches. I kept trying to put that at the start of
Oh,
the book, and then I realized, no, it's so grim, and it was just, kind of, I thought later too, is too on the nose about suffocation and a bad marriage. So then I got the idea for the beginning, about how, let's see if I have it here. I don't think I have the book here. How I know every woman looks better after a divorce. And then that was the rhythm. I know every woman looks better after a divorce. That sort of helped the book take off for me because it seems counterfactual, but there's also a kind of truth in it. I have seen women who, after a divorce, blossom and are very
hmm.
happy and all, but it's like something that the character would notice. But I think for your question, I think a lot of it came about rhythmically. Once I knew the characters, I could figure out and knew their motivations, knew kind of their agendas. Then I kind of knew the rhythms that they would take, and it's always in response to Tabitha, what she draws out of them.
Okay, yeah, actually, you mentioned the characters, and I wanted to say that there are a ton of subplots in this story. But what the amazing thing is that it's each subplot is connected to a character that Tabitha has some kind of interaction with. Some of them they're mentioned once or twice, and that's it. But there is like what I'm a big fan of setups and payoffs in screenwriting, that you introduce the character early on, but we don't ever hear about them for like another 60 or 75 pages. And like the one that immediately comes to mind is I guess the intern slash assistant, I would say Tinker Flats.
Yeah.
It seems like we always hear about her and Tabitha's attitude towards her, and that but her actual contact and interaction with her seems very minimal. That
Mhm.
it's always like the publisher has an update about Tinker Flats, or Tinker Flats is rooming with Tabitha's mother, and there's a party, and I think that's probably the biggest concentration of interaction that they have. But the name is peppered throughout the story. So I guess the big question for you is that was that intentional, that you had all of these characters and you wanted to have Tabitha interacting with them some way, some much more than others. Like Leon, the nephew, he is a big part of the story, so he's
Mhm.
everywhere. But there's also just a handful of characters that we only hear from a handful of times. Was that intentional, or did you just think, okay, I like this character, I'm gonna set this up, and I'm gonna have some kind of payoff? 18 chapters. Well, there are no chapters. 100 pages down.
Oh, maybe it's all a mistake. I do know, when thinking about a character, and how you think, oh, what would they hate? What would they hate? And Tabitha would hate having an intern. She's too independent to have an intern, and it seems like an insult. And it's coming from this publisher who really, just kind of uses her in some ways, almost as a kind of joke in some ways. So her not putting her much in her notes would kind of make sense within this world. There's a point too where Tinker suddenly shows up when Tabitha is with the handsome actor, and Tinker's continually insults Tabitha, but for Tabitha, it's interesting finally. You know, she almost likes her better when she insults her, but she also fears that her publisher will actually have Tabitha take on all these have Tinker take on these projects, and Tabitha will just have been used as kind of the starter horse to get them started. So I also think something someone pointed out to me is that Tabitha doesn't like to be among crowds. She likes to be kind of alone. And even when she's with people whom she adores, she retreats into herself a bit. So I think that it's kind of cognizant, you know, of her, you know, the loneliness. Part of it's self-imposed, part of it is, you know, a feature of her introversion. Part of it is that she actually can be easily hurt, so she turns insults into precise bits of language that then can be dealt with more easily. So she's got a kind of armor through language, I think.
Hmm. Yeah, and I was realizing that the character Rosamund, which is Tabitha's publisher, that she is very prevalent throughout the book as well. However, it seems the only way that Tabitha and Rosamund interact is through emails. And my first thought was that just seems really weird. But then I realized that's probably really accurate for dealing with a publisher. That they're not going to call you on the phone. That if they have something to tell you, they'll most likely just send you an email and you respond, and then it's just a lot of back and forth, back and forth. So I'm guessing that based on your experience working with publishers, that you felt this is the most accurate way to portray that relationship.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I've had publishers that I've never you know, spoken with, you know, in person. I have great publishers though, and they, you know, and some we will eventually meet. You know, some things
Hmm.
just happen, and you don't, you know, the stars aren't aligned. But I must say I've been really fortunate with publishers and with editors, and you know, but it is true, it's through email, you know, but the emails can be very warm and comforting. I'm very grateful to Jacob Smolian, who published Tabitha Get Up, who I sent it to him, and he wrote back to me a kind of email that's like a writer's dream, because he understood things about the novel that I could only hope someone would understand.
Well, that is fantastic. So, okay, again, the book is called Tabitha Get Up, and Lee Upton it is our guest today. Lee, so okay, you alluded to these earlier, so it sounds like you have a couple of books coming out, one next year and one in 2026.
Yeah, it's and I'll mention them.
Please.
Yeah, next year is the literary mystery Wrongful that's coming out, and it's about a two literary conferences 10 years apart. At the first one, a famous writer disappears. 10 years later, a woman tries to figure out what exactly happened. And then in 2026, I have a novel coming out called The Withers, and it's about a kind of a little bit of a future world ahead of us, where a what is a kind of a foodborne illness has affected a lot of the Northeast coast, and a woman whose body did not respond to the sorts of organ transplants that were required. She and anyone like her developed these bodily markings that cause people to be revolted by her.
Hmm.
That sounds very, very grim. At the same time, it's a kind of story of friendship and love. And then also in 2026, the sequel to Tabitha will come out.
Oh, wow.
You know, this book is Tabitha Get Up. The sequel is called Tabitha Stay Up. And so
I really thought you were
I'm
going to say
excited.
Tabitha Sit Down.
Yes, have a sit down. Yeah, Tabitha. Yeah, I don't know what more I can do with her. I think this is the end. I missed her voice, so I,
Hmm.
tried that, but and I was even thinking maybe I shouldn't sequel's always going to disrupt the life of the character. You can't, because life disrupts us all. So, and I thought, oh, should I just leave her at this point where the book ends? And then I missed her. I missed those rhythms. I missed, being in that world. And so I wrote a sequel, and happily enough, is going to be published. And then I also I'm going to have new and selected poems coming out the following year, 2027, from Saturnalia Press. So I just found that will work out. I just found that out a couple of weeks ago, or no, it was only like a couple of days ago, actually. Um, but my sense of time is all collapsing. So it's odd to have all this work coming out. It's very
Hmm.
odd, but I have a lot of work that didn't come out, and there's been a lot of novels before these novels that crumbled, or I had to dissect them and cannibalize them and turn them into other forms. So it's been a real streak of good fortune, and I can't say enough about Sagging Meniscus. They're unconventional publishers. They're wonderful, and the Withers is coming out from Regal House Publishing. Is there, so I'll be, you know, dealing with that publisher also. So
Oh,
I've been lucky.
that's great. So Lee, let's wrap things up. What I always like to ask our guests is like, what advice do you have for writers? I mean, like I always want to say a little tidbit or something. This is what helped, get me through the tough times. I mean, whatever you would like to dispense.
Okay, gosh, yeah, well, I have probably too much advice because I'm always having to give myself advice to try to get through this. The standard advice people say to read and read and read and read everything, of course. And I also think it's really useful to read with a pen in hand. And
Hmm.
I know some people think books are sacrosanct, but I think I mark them up, and I have an outline. I just the first reading for me is a kind of immersive, and I'm in that world. And so I don't know how it's done, so I have to extract myself and then kind of figure it out analytically, so that maybe later when I'm writing intuitively, I haven't even thought about it, but I've absorbed something. So I think there's a kind of active reading one can do. I think it's really important to develop a kind of trust in yourself, and that sometimes when something occurs to you and it seems really off the mark and that it won't work, to just follow it a bit and see where it might lead, because everything's coming from the same mind. So things are connected. Something I've talked about before is kind of I call it listening for breathing in the labyrinth. What I mean is that when you're stuck on a manuscript, you kind of go back and read earlier, particularly toward the beginning of the manuscript that you've written, to see if you can hear your breathing labyrinth. You can hear there's something in there that wants to emerge. Very often the trouble starts early in the book, or the magical surprise starts early. So go back and retrace your steps. And just kind of listen very quietly without feeling you have to hold on and grasp what you've written, kind of, just to see what's there. That's really helped to me. I think I used to just try to pummel the work to death, and now I kind of, just, be more kind, more gentle with it, and kind of listen to the work. I really believe in kind of pop out outlines, that when I'm writing something, particularly a novel, at a certain point, I keep outlining it again and again, because otherwise it's too complex. I can't see what I've done. So I'll pop out of it and kind of do a little map of what I've done, and see if it's working. And and then, I can see if there's enough attention, enough of conflicting forces within the piece, because there always has to be tension, even if
Mhm.
it's, you're doing this beautiful day, there's always a sense that there's something can go wrong within the piece. So that the sense too of writing is really suspense writing, all writing, including poetry. There's a kind of suspense that is it within the work that you're playing with to I think not giving up too early. I've had times where if I hadn't been contacted through enormous good luck that someone wanted the manuscript, I might have given up and broken the piece into parts and stuff. So trying not to lose faith, to endure in it. I think, overall, the most useful thing for me is gratitude, to just think how grateful I am, but how grateful anyone is that you have this wonderful thing in your life that you can read, you can write. It doesn't take a lot of money to do what we do. It takes time though, and time is so essential. But how lucky to be moved by poems, to be moved by fiction. How lucky to try, out of admiration, to create something in those forms. So that's what I would say. I can go on for too long because I'm
I
always
totally I
thinking
was going
about
to
what
say
I'm
all of those
doing.
things are so relatable. So it all makes perfect sense. Lee, where can people find out more about you? Are you on any social media platforms?
I know I have a website, www.leeupton, leupton.com. I'm on Facebook, Lee Upton. I'm on Instagram, which I'm not very good at. I have a rabbit. I put pictures of my rabbit on there.
Okay.
So that I have a Twitter account, but it is unused. I mean, that seems like going into the the depths of depravity. I mean, some of the stuff that people say on there, I don't know if I'm ready for Twitter. Maybe I should try that out. I read my friends' work, but I don't contribute. But that's where they find me. And the book, and Tabitha Get Up, and all the books, they're on Amazon, on bookshop.org. They're all over the
And they
place.
and they can get them through your website as well, leeupton.com, or you at least have links there.
Yeah, I do have
Okay.
links for it.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Again, the book is Tabitha Get Up, and Lee Upton has been our guest today. Lee, thank you so much for being here. This is a wonderful conversation.
Oh, thank you. And wishing you all good luck with screenwriting and all you do. And I'm so happy to have your book, which I've begun reading. So
Oh,
go
thank
ahead and
you.
ask. Yeah,
Yeah,
so
I
good luck.
appreciate
And
that. All right, audience, if you have enjoyed today's podcast, please hit like and subscribe, leave a comment, tell your friends. You can check out my screenwriting blog, Maximum Z. It's at maximumz.blog. I'm still on Twitter at maximum_Z, and you can also follow the Twitter account for this show at podcast CWL. I'm also on Instagram at Pez Screenwriting, PEZ. And as Lee just showed you, I've got my Go Ahead and Ask books. They're available through Amazon. There are 3 volumes, so feel free to buy all 3. Like I said, that's Lee. I'm Paul. This has been the Creative Writing Life podcast. Thanks for listening. Stay safe, stay healthy, and most importantly, go write something.